spoilers ahead.
Bones and All is a 2022 romantic horror movie directed and produced by Luca Guadagnino. It stars Taylor Russell and Timothée Chalamet.
Some people thought Bones and All was a delicious hybrid of horror, road trip, and romance, while other people thought it was a vapid, hollowed-out shell of a film. Let's take a look at the plot of Bones and All so I can show you why this cannibal horror movie is actually about the power of love. Just watching there to see the subscriber count plummeting?
The plot.
The movie opens in 1980s Virginia. We meet a teenage Marin who lives with her single dad Frank, and they're new in town. Marin's awkward, so her friend invites her around for a sleepover so she can get friendly with some of the other girls. So she sneaks out to the party and everything's going brilliantly until she degloves one of the girls' fingers.
If you'd like to see something sincerely horrific, well beyond the scope of anything I'll ever review on this channel, look up some images of degloved hands.
Marin bolts off home, and when Frank recognizes what she's done, he puts their practiced escape plan into motion. They hit the road and head for Maryland. Now we know why they're new in town. We jump ahead to Marin's 18th birthday in Maryland. She wakes up to find her dad's abandoned her now that she's legally an adult. He leaves her a birth certificate, some money, and a cassette with a recorded message on it. On the tape, Frank tells his daughter she won't see him again because he can't do anything more for her. He talks about the first time Marin ate somebody when she killed her babysitter at the age of 3. He talks about all the other times along the way he was forced to uproot his life to protect her from the police. Ultimately, it was her lack of remorse that led him to leaving, and he tells her he hopes one day she'll learn to overcome her ghastly urges. Marin has no memories of her mother, but her birth certificate tells her she was born in Minnesota, so she heads in that direction. On her way, she stops into Columbus, Ohio, where she meets Sully, played by Mark Rylance, who better get some kind of award for his performance, because wow. Sully's afflicted by the same urges Marin is, so he was able to pick her up by her scent. The unlikely pair head to a house where Sully teaches her how to use her own sense of smell to locate both food and other eaters, as they refer to themselves. He then tells her there's a woman upstairs who's on her last legs. He says he sniffed her out earlier and found her that way. And he mentors Marin in the ways of practical cannibalism. After a good night's sleep, Marin wakes to find Scully making continental breakfast out of the now deceased woman. So she joins in and the pair bond over their shared afflictions. While Scully's showering, she sneaks out. Sully watches her leave. She ends up in Indiana, and while she's stealing a few things, she meets another eater named Lee, who lures a man outside after he verbally assaulted a woman in the shop. Marin's nose leads her to Lee in a nearby shed. After he's eaten the man, he takes his keys and offers Marin a ride. The pair head cross-country, and with so much in common, they fall in love. They head to Lee's home state of Kentucky, so they can spend the night at his deceased aunt's house. He tells her he can't be seen in town and asks if she needs an explanation, but she doesn't. Lee's sister Kyla shows up at the house and rips into him for never being around, so they decide to leave instead of spending the night. They stop in a park for a snooze and they meet Jake and Brad, who sniffed them out because they're eaters too. That night around the campfire, Jake introduces them to the concept of bones and all, or eating everything, which is apparently an entirely better dining experience. But Marin can't get past the fact Brad eats people voluntarily. He isn't one of them. It's not compulsion. So Lee and Marin sneak off when the men fall asleep for fear of their own safety. While they're checking out a local carnival, Marin says she's hungry. Instead of cotton candy, Lee snags them a carnival worker. And after they've stuffed themselves full of them, Marin gets a case of the guilties when they find out the guy had a wife and kids. Using a phone book, Marin finds the home of her grandmother, Barbara, who wasn't even aware she existed and isn't all that happy to see her. Barbara tells Marin her mother was adopted and that she'd voluntarily checked herself into a psychiatric hospital in Fergus Falls. So Marin goes to Fergus Falls, and her mother, played by Chloe Savini, has had a letter waiting for her for 15 years in case she ever showed up. Marin has to read it herself because her mother's chewed her own hands off. The letter ends with her mother telling her she'd be better off dead. To make up for all the things she never did for her as her mother, she attacks her to kill her. The nurse intervenes before her mother can get her teeth into her. The exchange drives a wedge between Marin and Lee. so she leaves while he's sleeping. But she doesn't get far before Sully shows up. He's been following her for weeks because he believes there's a connection between them. When she denies him the fantasy, we catch a glimpse of his true colors. Marin makes her way back to Kentucky where she bumps into Lee's sister Kayla. She learns the truth about Lee's abusive father, so she tracks Lee down at the lake where he's staying. Lee fills her in on the missing details of his father's disappearance. He tells her his father was also an eater like them. The last time he attacked him, his father sunk his teeth into him, which led to an all-out brawl that ended with Lee eating his father. Marin tells him she loves him. They vow to build a normal life together doing things normal people do. A few months later, Sully arrives to destroy their normal life. A fight breaks out between the three of them. Marin and Lee overpower him and finish him off, but Lee's fatally stabbed in the exchange. As he's bleeding out, he asks Marin to eat him, bones and all, which she eventually does.
And there you have it, folks, the plot to Bones and All. Let's take a look at the good bits, which I believe were the ribs?
For the sake of argument and to help illustrate my point, let's agree for now that cannibalism is the worst thing a human being could partake in. Then I'll need you to play along for a few minutes by allowing yourself to see the cannibalism in this movie as a metaphor for the flaws and the faults that make all of us feel isolated and alone at times. Once you've done that, it gets easier to see Bones and All as a movie about the power of love. The story starts with a demonstration of fatherly love. Despite his intimate knowledge of Marin's predispositions, Frank spent 18 years routinely upending his own life to keep his daughter safe. Even when he's recalling the babysitter's death on the tape, he's relieved the babysitter wasn't wearing earrings, so his 3-year-old daughter didn't choke when she devoured her ear. He does eventually abandon her in the name of self-preservation, but he stayed until she was an adult, and he left her a full explanation and the map she'll need to answer all of her questions in the form of her birth certificate. Her father's actions prove unconditional love is not a conscious thing or a decision somebody makes. It's a powerful thing you're not in control of. After her father leaves, Marin meets Lee, who's as damaged as she is in a metaphorical sense. The intimacy that develops between them inevitably causes her to examine herself. Relationships can have a mirroring effect when you realize your flaws and faults have the power to affect somebody other than yourself. In Lee, she sees somebody comfortable with his faults because he believes he's powerless to change them, and in that way, he represents a potential version of Marin's future self. She accepts herself the way she is. Lee is her future. After the devastating meeting with her mother, Lee tells her she has 3 choices. Either keep doing what she's doing, join her mother inside, or end things. In other words, she can be like him, who feels powerless. She can be like her mother, whose flaws have destroyed her, or she can give up entirely. But Marin's journey has opened her up to another option. That's one of self-love. She chooses instead to try. She chooses to be like other people. This new love she's developed for Lee spurs her to invite him along on this last leg of her journey. For them, being like other people is represented by their simple, unremarkable apartment. It looks like everyone else's. They appear like normal people, and once they're inside it, Luca Guadagnino wraps up the story in a way that only he could have. When Sully breaks in, he represents everything Marin chose not to be. His self-hatred renders him so incapable of the introspection Marin's just undertaken, he refers to himself in the third person. When she first met him, she couldn't understand why he was doing it, but she does now. Killing Sully is a declaration of her self-love, and his death represents the death of the possibility she'll ever allow her faults to defeat her. It is the perfect end to her character arc, from a place of helplessness to a place of control. During the abrupt, violent ending, the camera cuts away to external shots of the house and the trees. Everything's silent and peaceful, but we know what's going on inside. This is the director reminding us, in reality, there are no normal people. We're all dealing with our own things every day, no matter how we appear on the outside. He's telling us the best we can do is to try and be better.
The Shite Bits.
I completely understand why Guadagnino took this to the nth degree to make his point. The more I think about it, the more I realize he had no choice artistically. I just think it's a shame so many people won't see this movie because of what he's chosen to represent pain and trauma. And sadly, for a lot of people, the film's real message will end up buried under the viscera and blood. So, should you watch Bones and All if you haven't seen it already? Or should you chew this movie up and spit it out because everybody knows real horror should have nothing to do with mushy, lovey-dovey shite?
There are a few legitimately gruesome scenes in this movie, and if you don't think you can handle that kind of thing, you might want to give this a miss. However, if you feel you can handle it or you want to give it a try, there is a great story here and an even greater message behind the story. And I'd highly recommend you checking it out. Until next time, folks.
It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!